Hi, everyone. This is the Encyclopedia channel, and we will continue to explain the most tragic war after World War II. The most tragic war after World War II was the First World War in Africa, with 5 to 6 million civilian casualties, unprecedented in the modern peaceful environment. And this war took place from 1998 to 2002, but I guess few people know that there was such a bloody war in the world. The predecessor of the First African World War was the Rwandan genocide. I think everyone should know about the Rwanda genocide according to the Rwanda Hotel, but not many people know about the follow-up of this incident. Rwanda was formerly a colony of Belgium. At that time, there were two ethnic groups living in this land. One was the Hutu, which accounted for 80% of the population, and the other was the Tutsi, which accounted for 20% of the population. There was no contradiction between the two. For centuries, the two parties intermarried, spoke the same language, believed in the same religion, and lived together. The only difference between the two is that the Tutsi herd and the Hutu farm. But everything changed after the Europeans came. The Belgian colonists advocated a brutal slavery system in Africa, using all blacks as slaves, and at the same time detaining the wives and children of the slaves and forcing the slaves to work. If the slave resisted, the slave was punished with whipping and cutting his hands. During the few years of Belgian King Leopold's rule, 15 million slaves in Congo were persecuted to death by him. The brutal colonial rule of Belgium aroused the resistance of the local people. The Belgian ruler was afraid that the suppression would attract interference from other European powers in the name of human rights, so in order to weaken the resistance, he came up with a vicious strategy. The Belgian rulers declared the minority Tutsi a superior race and the Hutu majority an inferior race. And give the Tutsis a small amount of privileges and try their best to create conflicts between the Hutus and the Tutsi. Belgium's strategy was very successful. Through this series of racial discrimination policies, Belgium successfully turned the Tutsi and Hutu from being comrades in arms who lived in harmony and jointly resisting the Belgian colonists into enemies who turned against each other. People tend to hate the petty officials and local tyrants who are only 1 or 2 levels above him more than the emperor who is aloof. Belgium successfully transferred the conflict between colonists and slave labor to the hatred between Tutsi and Hutu. After this, Belgian rule over Rwanda began to be firmly established and lasted until 1962. After Belgium was forced to withdraw from Rwanda in 1962, it handed over the colony to the Hutus, who accounted for the majority of the population. To provoke ethnic conflicts and then reap the benefits of the fishermen. The poor Hutus and Tutsi believe this nonsense in Belgium. After gaining power, the Hutu immediately took up the butcher knife and launched a bloody revenge against the Tutsis. For more than 2 decades, the Tutsis have been living under the racial discrimination system of the Rwandan government. Beginning in 1990, Tutsi refugees who were brutally persecuted raised the banner of an uprising. They formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and with the support of Uganda, they began to attack the Rwandan government. During the civil war in Rwanda, the war intensified the hatred between the two sides. The Hutus promoted the Tutsis as the enemy of the country in the territory, and the Tutsi also expelled a large number of Hutu refugees in their occupied areas. Because of the years of war, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana signed a peace treaty with the Tutsi armed forces in 1993. It is a pity that the good times did not last long. In 1994, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was assassinated to death. His death was the most horrific ethnic vendetta in the 20th century, the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. After the president's death, the radio station controlled by the Hutu militant Akazu issued a broadcast announcement, insisting that the murder of the president was a Tutsi extremist. Publish the list of public enemies and ask the Hutus across the country to start massacring the Tutsis. Under the instigation of the radio, the Hutus turned into devils one after another and started the genocide against the Tutsis. Hutu citizens took machetes and sticks to massacre their neighbors. In order to wipe out the Tutsis, the targets of attack were Tutsis, women and children first. After the brutal killing, the Hutu feared that the Tutsis would retaliate against them, so they became even more ruthless. There are even rumors that killing the Tutsi can get the farm, so the killing is even more tragic. During this period, some Tutsis even took money and begged the Hutu to shoot him in the head with a gun instead of chopping him into a pulp with a machete. More than 100 days later, the Tutsi armed forces learned of the incident. They united with Uganda, which is also a Tutsi regime, and invaded Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, in July, completely defeating the racially discriminatory Hutu government. This brutal massacre killed 800,000 to 1 million Tutsis within 100 days, accounting for 10% of the Rwandan population. During the 100-day Rwandan genocide, more than 2 million Hutus whose hands were stained with Tutsi blood during the genocide fled to neighboring Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zaire, now Democratic Republic of the Congo, thousands of whom died in refugee camps from cholera and dysentery. This is the Rwandan genocide, but the Rwandan genocide is only the beginning. The Akazu organization, the instigator of the Rwandan massacre, fled to Zaire, where Mobutu was in power at the time, and established a guerrilla base with Mobutu's acquiescence. It began to attack Rwanda across the border, massacred the Tutsi in an attempt to further intensify racial conflicts, and firmly tied the Hutu in the country to its own chariot. The Tutsi government at that time had been engaged in racial reconciliation, trying to eliminate the contradictions between the Hutu and Tutsis. After the war, the first order of the new Rwandan government was to stop the use of ID cards indicating ethnicity. The people of the whole country are required to live as Rwandan nationals regardless of whether they are Hutu or Tutsis. Even the positions of president and prime minister are held by moderate Hutus, so the extreme armed Akazu of the Hutus are worried about most of the Hutus in the country people really reconciled with the Tutsis, so they continued to launch guerrilla warfare to harass the Rwandan border and massacre the Tutsi, trying to anger the Tutsi government and arouse further conflicts between the Tutsi and Hutu. The Rwandan government is extremely angry at Akazu's behavior of undermining racial reconciliation and continuously creating racial antagonism. Therefore, President Mobutu of Zaire is constantly asked to hand over the extreme Hutu armed Akazu, and Mobutu has ruled Zaire for more than 30 years. A country ruled by kleptocrats, during Mobutu's dictatorship for more than 30 years. The Mobutu family became so rich that Mobutu had to warn, you should steal less, or steal smarter, you can invest in those industries with good returns instead of transferring funds abroad. GDP has dropped by 65% compared to before Mobutu came to power, and it has fallen from the third largest country in Africa to one of the least developed countries in the world. Faced with such a severe situation, Mobutu raised the banner of racism in an attempt to divert the conflict. There is also a group of Tutsis living in the east of Zaire. Mobutu imitated the Belgian ruler and instigated conflicts between the Tutsis and Hutus in Zaire, trying to pass on the contradictions. He allowed the Hutu extremist Akazu to attack the Tutsis, and even dispatched government troops to help. At the same time, an order was issued in October 1996. All Tutsis were ordered to leave Zaire within a week, or they would be expelled by force. The unbearable Tutsis were forced to revolt, which set off the prelude to the First African World War. Zaire's Tutsis formed a rebel army called the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of the Congo, led by Kabila, who had fought alongside Che Guevara, and they rebelled in eastern Zaire. The Rwandan Tutsi government, which had long been intolerable for Mobutu's protection of Akazu, immediately joined forces with the Tutsi regime in Angola, Uganda, and began to fund Kabila, and invaded Zaire with multinational troops to help Kabila fight. At the same time, although countries such as Burundi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe did not directly participate in the war, they also provided varying degrees of support to the Alliance of Liberation Democratic Forces, including helping to transfer troops, providing arms and supplies. With the help of many African countries, Kabila swept across the country within 3 months and entered Kinshasa on May 17, 1997, driving out Mobutu. Mobutu died of prostate cancer in the same year. Kabila became president of Zaire at the same time Mobutu fled, and changed the country's name to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. However, no one expected that the peace lasted only 1 year. Because Kabila came to power mainly relying on the armed support of the Tutsi occupied a large number of important government positions, causing dissatisfaction among other ethnic groups. The anti-Tutsi wave of resisting Tutsi invasion was set off, but Kabila did not identify himself as a Tutsi, but he identified himself as a communist without a nationality. So he was after a communist regime, not a Tutsi nationalist regime. Therefore, he compromised with the anti-Tutsi forces and began to cleanse the Tutsi people in the government. At the same time, he returned to his hometown to recruit some people who had the same ideals as him, trying to fight against the Tutsi people. He also occupied the eastern part of Rwanda with the biggest enemy of the Rwandan government. The Akazu, a large number of fleeing Hutu armed groups, cooperated and even refused to grant citizenship to the Tutsis in Congo. On July 28, 1998, Kabila issued an order requiring the Tutsis to leave the Democratic Republic of the Congo. All this aroused serious dissatisfaction among the Tutsis. Revolt again. At the same time, the Rwandan government is also quite dissatisfied with Kabila's behavior of shielding the Rwandan mass murderer. So he was angered again, and the Ugandan army cooperated with the Tutsis rebels to attack the Democratic Republic of Congo. In just a few days, it reached a distance of 30 kilometers from Kinshasa. Amid the chaos, Kabila turned to South Africa's Chad, Angola, Libya, Zimbabwe and Namibia to start fighting the Rwandan and Ugandan forces. At the same time, other powers in the world have also taken a fancy to Congo's rich mineral resources, and have funded and supported the armies and rebels of various countries in Congo, taking advantage of the chaos to plunder resources. Hundreds of European and Asian companies have entered Congo to plunder Congo's minerals. Rwanda exported minerals that far exceeded its own production that year, while developed countries knew that the minerals came from plundering and still bought them in large quantities. The United States, Russia and other permanent members support the Congolese government on the surface, but they also provide funds to Uganda and Rwanda in private, hedging their bets. Considering the flow of funds in the world at that time, this war was a veritable world war, and the major powers in the world all invested and supported agents. So in 1998, the First World War in Africa, in which more than a dozen African countries participated and invested by major countries in the world, officially kicked off. Although there are many allies sending troops to support and the support of major powers, Kabila is still at a disadvantage in the war. In 1999, Kabila lost half of the eastern part of the country and began to confront the multinational allied forces with his own 60,000 troops. The irony is that most of these 60,000 people are former Akazu members called the Hutu Liberation Army, that is, the Rwandan massacre Mobutu's main supporter, Kabila's biggest opponent in the civil war. Because of the stalemate on the battlefield, this African world war has evolved from a battle of large corps to frequent harassment of small groups of armed guerrillas, while the guerrillas are hidden among the masses. This has led to the remarkable feature of this war. The army casualties were not large, but the civilian casualties were staggering. The number of casualties even reached the highest value of 5 million civilian casualties after World War II. At the same time, the two sides that have gone crazy, as well as the bandit armed forces in the Congo, have fewer and fewer soldiers. At the beginning, countries recruited the unemployed to join the army. Later, the source of soldiers expanded to the poor, and later even children were kidnapped to join the army. It has become the norm for 200 adults to kidnap children and make up 10,000 armed forces. The government army is not doing well either. The Hutu Liberation Army took advantage of the opportunity of the war to wantonly plunder the villages and people's property in Congo. The situation in Congo in the later period was extremely chaotic. Rwanda and Uganda also turned against each other for underground resources and attacked each other. There were more than 20 armed organizations in the east alone, and ethnic vendettas and tribal conflicts were everywhere with machetes as weapons. And the government army is not much better. Namibia could not afford the expenditure of its own army overseas for a long time and withdrew all its troops in 2001. Most of the other countries sent troops symbolically, so they slowly withdrew their troops. The main force of the government army is to show its status as a big country and challenge South Africa's status in South Africa. Zimbabwe has sent 10,000 soldiers, accounting for 1/3 of its military expenditure. The huge military expenditure has dragged down Zimbabwe. From 1999 to 2000, the fiscal deficit expanded from 11.9% of GDP to 22.7%. In 2000, the annual inflation rate of Zimbabwe exceeded 62%, and the unemployment rate reached over 50%. Ironically, however, Zimbabwe, which was determined to challenge South Africa, was dragged down by the war. However, South Africa sold weapons to Uganda and Rwanda, and instead made a lot of money in the war. Among them, South Africa is an African shitstick, funding almost all rebel armed forces in Africa, and is a paradise for mercenaries, sending mercenaries to interfere in other countries' internal wars at every turn. Take this to make a lot of war money and sit firmly in South Africa's first-place throne. The war ended in 2001, when Kabila was assassinated by bodyguards, and his son Kabila Jr. quickly took over as president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And after taking office, he actively sought to achieve national reconciliation with various domestic opposition forces, and worked hard to improve relations with Uganda and Rwanda. At the same time, Uganda, Angola and Rwanda also earned enough in the war. So after difficult negotiations, in October 2002, all foreign troops withdrew from the Congo. In April 2003, the National Political Dialogue Conference closed in Sun City, South Africa, and the First World War in Africa, which lasted 7 years, finally came to an end. Congo after the war can be said to be devastated, with 5 million people killed in the war. This figure is dwarfed by the prelude to the Rwanda massacre, and the economy of the Democratic Republic of Congo has been devastated. In 1990, the per capita GDP was still $240, but in 2000 it dropped sharply to $85. The IMF pointed out that starting from 2002, assuming that the average annual population growth rate of Congo, Kinshasa, is 35, it will take 45 years for per capita GDP to return to the 1990 level. After the war, although the Tutsis in Congo obtained Congolese nationality, they still suffered from discrimination, and inter-ethnic vendettas occurred from time to time. In 2004, Laurent Nkunda, a government army commander of Tutsi origin, launched a rebellion on the grounds that the Tutsi were treated unfairly, and involved the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo in a new round of war. To this day, border conflicts in Congo continue, and civilians are killed at a rate of 1,000 a day. In the Global 2012 Failed States Index compiled by the U.S. Foundation for Peace, the Democratic Republic of the Congo scored highest 5th. The World War in Africa is over, but the precious peace has not yet come to this bloody land. Okay, that's all for now. You are welcome to leave a message in the comment area to discuss with everyone.